Discover the Our MedTech Lives podcast, where industry experts share their career stories, key achievements, and insights into overcoming challenges in the MedTech field. Hosted by Zilko Rima and Kash Ikram.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Our MedTech Lives. Today we're going to be talking to Gardiner Harris, who is a pharmaceutical reporter, and this is going to be a mind-blowing episode. Gardiner started his career in Kentucky, where he moved into the business of industry reporting, and while working at the Appalachian Bureau, Harris uncovered systematic problems in the coal industry, rigged coal dust tests, corporate misdeed, and here he got his first taste for fighting for justice. His work there earned him a significant recognition. He got the George Pollock Award for environmental reporting and the Worth Bingham Prize for investigative journalism. He then later on became a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, covering the pharmaceutical industry. At the Journal, Gardiner Harris' pharmaceutical investigations have achieved significant impact. One of his major investigations involved Bristol Myers Squibb, major pharmaceutical company. His reporting contributed to criminal charges against top executives in the company and corporate action. He was nominated then for a Pulitzer Prize. And today, his latest book about the activities of Johnson & Johnson, called No More Tears in their pharma and medtech industry. Please check out the book, No More Tears. Today's going to be an explosive episode. We're not going to shy away from the tough questions in our industry. So Gardiner Harris, welcome to Our MedTech Lives.
I'm honored to be here. Thanks for having me on your show.
Hi, Gardiner. Can you please, before we go into the topics, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you came to be a drugs reporter for the New York Times?
Sure. I went to Yale. My first job was actually on Wall Street. I didn't do all that well. I was a math guy, but I didn't really like that world. I eventually found my way into journalism. Actually, my first newspaper was in San Luis Obispo, California, this tiny little town. And then I became a cop reporter in Louisville, Kentucky. I ended up getting the police chief in Louisville indicted. And unfortunately, the chief had this black bag intelligence unit that started surveilling me. And there were a lot of guys with guns around me, and my editors got worried about my safety, so they sent me out to Hazard, where as Kashif said, I did this investigation on coal dust in the coal mines, but I did a whole bunch of other investigations. Again, some more death threats followed. I then went to the Wall Street Journal, and the hot beat in the 90s, as you guys might remember, was the drug beat. So they gave me that. I became the principal drug reporter for the Wall Street Journal. I knew pretty much all the CEOs of all the major pharma companies and some of the device companies. As Kashif said, I ended up investigating Bristol Myers Squibb. I became very good friends with the PR guy who was my counterpart at Bristol Myers. We went to basketball games, and then I ended up doing a kind of a tough story on Bristol. I told my friend Charlie that I had to, and he understood. And as soon as the story came out, Charlie's boss called me and he said, "Gardiner, I just fired your friend Charlie. Actions have consequences. Actions have consequences." I then spent the next 4 months investigating Bristol, came out with that investigation that led to criminal charges against 3 top executives, the firing of the CEO. And I called that guy back and I said, John, actions have consequences. Actions have consequences. I was then recruited to the New York Times. I was their top pharma writer. I ended up doing a bunch of stories that led to a very large, a $3 billion diabetes drug being withdrawn, hundreds of pediatric cough and cold medicines being withdrawn. I did work on conflicts of interest that led to the Physician Payment Sunshine Act. And then I went to India and was the South Asia correspondent for the New York Times. I came back, was a White House correspondent, and finally decided to leave and write this book.
The book is real labor of love. You takes us through a number of products, and the front end of the book is about pharma. I want to just run through some of those, right? Because how did J&J become one of the most trusted companies, come up with all these problems with products like their talcum powder to start with, then Tylenol, which has been in the news recently, Procrit, Risperidol, the opium epidemic, birth control patch. Let's take one at a time. Let's start with the talc. So why was the talc an issue?
So talc was an issue. So Johnson and Johnson at its birth was basically sold bandages, and they sold this kind of early on. You might remember there were these strange kind of bandages that were almost casts. And
Yes.
Johnson and Johnson was a big maker of these bandages, and these casts would have capsaicin in them or belladonna that would cause a kind of irritation. And originally Johnson and Johnson started sending out little tins of Italian talc just to deal with the skin irritation that came from these, what they were known as plasters. And then they realized there was a real market here. So they started selling Johnson's baby powder, because talc, as you may know, is the smoothest mineral sold. And when talc, or it's also known as soapstone when it's solid, is ground up, if you put it in your fingers, it's so fine it almost feels like oil. And it's the softest mineral on the planet, and has been used for thousands of years as a cosmetic, really to make skin whiter. As you know, in much of the world, like when I was in India, the biggest selling cosmetics are skin whiteners.
Yeah.
So Johnson and Johnson got into this business very honestly. It was a wonderful product. People really liked it, and they added to their talc this fragrance that soon became the most widely recognized fragrance on the planet, that became Johnson's baby powder. And for generations, mothers really associated the most wonderful things with that smell, which was helping their baby. Around the 1950s, Johnson and Johnson began to discover that something came along with talc that was concerning, and that something was asbestos.
Yes.
Asbestos and talc, they are almost identical from a chemical mineralogical point of view. And so asbestos veins are always found in talc mines. You can't get away from them, and you can't entirely eliminate asbestos when you mine for talc. And Johnson and Johnson understood this in the 1950s and the 1960s. But back then, the thinking was that small amounts of asbestos wouldn't be that big of a deal, because asbestos was everywhere in American life. And there wasn't a car, a boat, a train that didn't have asbestos in it. It wasn't until the 1960s that these studies, these sort of residential exposure studies, where women started understanding that they were getting mesothelioma because they washed their husband's clothes, who worked in areas with asbestos, or other people got mesothelioma because they lived a couple of miles down from an asbestos mine. It was in the 1960s that researchers began to understand that even microscopic quantities of asbestos could kill people. And that's when Johnson and Johnson really kind of turned dark, because they wanted to protect this most iconic product of theirs. They started lying about the presence of asbestos in Johnson's baby powder. And then by the 1980s, when epidemiological studies really started showing that women who used talc-based product suffered much more ovarian cancer, they really dug in. And that's when things really turned very dark.
Yeah. So then that's when from reading your book, I understand that that's when they started to hold back information. So let's flip to Tylenol, because Tylenol originally was a really, a fantastic story, great branding story for J&J, right? When
Absolutely.
they had the tampering issues, and someone had tampered Tylenol and put cyanide in it, right?
As you guys know, there are all these NSAIDs, right? There are 20, 25 different NSAIDs. They operate, many of them, on sort of similar channels, the COX-1, COX-2 story. Acetaminophen is fundamentally different. And back in the late 1960s and early 1970s, that was seen as a real benefit because COX-1, COX-2 inhibitors have unfortunate effects on the stomach.
Right.
And remember, this is early in our lives.
Yes.
Remember that ulcers were a huge public health problem all the way up through 1982, that people would die of bleeding ulcers or, these ulcers that suddenly exploded open. You started vomiting blood and your life was in jeopardy. So the fact that NSAIDs could worsen that problem and that acetaminophen uniquely didn't made acetaminophen look safe by comparison to aspirin and all the other NSAIDs. Then in 1982, two Australian researchers discover that ulcers are the product of an H. pylori infection. And to solve your ulcer problem, all you need to do is take an antibiotic. And then suddenly acetaminophen's safety versus these other NSAIDs doesn't appear so great, particularly because uniquely among the NSAIDs, acetaminophen has a serious risk to the liver. Extra strength Tylenol is 500 milligrams of acetaminophen. It is the only over-the-counter medicine that the allowed dose over the counter is also the maximum dose. As you guys know, acetaminophen, also known as paracetamol in Europe, it's very hard to actually get 500 milligram pills in much of Europe. In Ireland, you can only buy 2 at a time, and you have to get them from the pharmacist. In the United States, you can buy these giant bottles of 500 milligrams. And the FDA became so concerned about the liver toxicity of acetaminophen that it actually lowered the allowed dose of acetaminophen paracetamol to 325 milligrams in prescription pills. So Tylenol is the only pill where the maximum over-the-counter dose is actually 60% higher than the maximum prescription dose. And FDA did that in large part because once they make things over the counter, they have an almost impossible time pulling it back legally. And the FDA actually wanted to shame Johnson & Johnson and the rest of the industry into doing this themselves. They obviously didn't. So the whole chapter about Tylenol is really about, you think this is the safest drug around. In fact, Tylenol is by far the most dangerous over-the-counter medicine sold, causes more death and injury than all other over-the-counter medicines combined.
That's incredible. But the Tylenol story that we know, that we were taught in business school, is the fact that Johnson & Johnson led the way for these caps that you struggle to get off with at 3:00 in the morning, right?
Right. So that story, the story that you've been told in business school is wrong. Yeah. And I retell that story. Yeah. And Johnson & Johnson's conduct, look, Johnson & Johnson didn't knowingly kill the 11 people who died in the 1982 Tylenol poisoning case in Chicago. Absolutely. But the company knew much more than it let on and was almost certainly paying the FDA commissioner at the time, which was illegal, which was why they managed to come out of that poisoning episode looking so good. So I retell the poisoning episode, that famous case study, which is the most famous Harvard Business School case study ever, is just wrong. And in fact, Harvard Business School has an entire library of case studies about Johnson & Johnson, more than 20, nearly all of which are wrong.
So let's move to Procrit, right? Because this was, when I read this, my jaw was on the ground, right? It was page after page of just shocking information. So, yeah, please tell us about the fertilizer.
What a lot of people know is EPO, right? And particularly in Europe, you guys are big into bicycle racing. And what everyone in Europe remembers EPO for is that Lance Armstrong and the U.S. Postal team used EPO to dope to win 7 Tours de France back to back to back.
Yes.
And so in Europe, EPO is widely known as, a doping mechanism particularly in aerobic endeavors like bike racing. Yes. But in fact, the biggest use of EPO was in cancer. Originally, it was developed because EPO. What EPO does is increase the production of red blood cells. Right, it stimulates your bone marrow to produce red blood cells, and when you're anemic, that can be helpful. And this is particularly true in patients who get kidney dialysis. Dialysis, as you may know, the filters in dialysis often destroy red blood cells. And the original thinking was, we give them EPO after dialysis, they won't need blood transfusions nearly as much because blood transfusions can cause problems.
Yes.
So that was the original case use. Johnson & Johnson partnered with the company Amgen that created EPO. Johnson & Johnson came up with this idea. Well, how about if we sell it to cancer patients? Because cancer patients who go through chemotherapy also sometimes become anemic. The problem was that Johnson & Johnson knew that EPO also tended to encourage tumors to grow. This was at the time, I don't know if you remember, but there was this famous researcher named Judah Folkman at the time who had come up with this anti-angiogenesis theory of cancer, which is that cancer tumors grow by sending out signals to the body saying, I need blood. The blood responds by providing new capillaries. Those capillaries then feed the tumor, and the tumor then grows. And Judah Folkman came up with this idea: if you could cut off the signaling for the capillaries, you could starve the tumors. That's anti-angiogenesis. And what Johnson & Johnson knew from the beginning was that EPO was a pro-angiogenesis signaling device. In other words, it told the body to give more blood to these tumors. So even though the company persuaded oncologists, and in the United States, EPO quickly became the most widely used drug in cancer, but Johnson & Johnson kept secret that EPO was quietly killing cancer patients. And it persuaded all oncologists in the United States to use this, and all cancer hospitals, in large measure because it was so profitable. In the United States, oncologists serve as both doctor and pharmacist. So they get a little markup from the drugs they use. And EPO's markup was the biggest around. So the average oncologist made about $300,000 in their practice, and they made another $300,000 just on their EPO prescriptions. And then Johnson & Johnson encouraged them to do insurance fraud by adding extra to the vials of EPO so that they didn't have to buy that, but they could charge insurers as if they did. And every cancer hospital was in on this massive insurance fraud that cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Yeah. So I know all this because I have the grand jury files in the EPO investigation. And the result of all of this criminality was nearly 500,000 deaths in the United States. Thankfully, because Europeans weren't paid and weren't frankly bribed to use EPO the way American oncologists were, European oncologists used about a third as much EPO as American oncologists. So EPO is a classic look at the difference between the American and European systems that you guys are in.
I think that's a fascinating discussion as well, because I read also in your book that you didn't have thalidomide in America. Because of Dr. Francis, I've forgotten her last name, but in the FDA, yeah, she was like, this doesn't look right. And in Europe, we had it. And then, in children that were 4 or 5 years older than me were coming out with these horrible disfigurations.
Yeah.
But then what's interesting, so in your book, you talk about bumping into a pharma rep at an airport, and she was selling Ripsidol, right? And it was being prescribed to her nephew. Am I correct in that, right? So tell us the story of this drug that was
Risperdal. So the people often identify the opioid crisis, for which actually Johnson & Johnson was the crucial player, as the largest public health crisis in the United States. It's not. It's actually the use of antipsychotics in the elderly population. And antipsychotics are, as you guys know, of course, their principal use and the most important use is in the treatment of schizophrenia and in the treatment of bipolar illness. But patients with dementia and Alzheimer's, particularly patients in nursing homes, they often wake up in the middle of the night. Dealing with those patients can be very expensive. You need nurses. And so what nursing homes, particularly in the United States, have done for a long time is they give them tranquilizers to essentially keep them asleep all night long. And the favorite tranquilizer is antipsychotics because they kind of can justify it. These are people with dementia. It's something close to hallucination. So they say, well, we'll treat them with antipsychotics. Well, they have known forever that antipsychotics actually kill these patients. And Johnson & Johnson knew it, kept that information secret, and nonetheless sold Risperdal for the use in these elderly populations aggressively. They also sold it for use in pediatric populations, even though Risperdal causes boys to grow breasts. Risperdal is the only antipsychotic that should never be used amongst young boys or even young girls. 15% of young girls who get Risperdal end up expressing milk from their breasts, which is, when it's a 10-year-old girl, is an incredibly frightening side effect. So the book, I actually have the grand jury files on the investigation here, and I estimate that Johnson & Johnson's crimes, and by the way, the company admitted to crimes here, that its crimes cost more than 1 million American lives. And, this comes up in COVID, for instance.
Yes.
I don't know if you remember, but the American nursing home deaths during COVID were among the worst in the world.
Yes.
And one reason is that Risperdal kills you two ways. One way is by causing heart attacks and strokes. The other way is by making you far more susceptible to respiratory infections. What's COVID? It's a respiratory infection. So this huge share of nursing home patients in the United States, and it's close to 15 to 20% of nursing home patients are on these drugs. And doctors hide why they're using these drugs by diagnosing dementia patients as having late onset schizophrenia. You and I both know there is no such thing as late onset schizophrenia. It's simply a dodge. And these grand jury files show that it's Johnson & Johnson that came up with this dodge, 20 years ago, and doctors are still using it.
Yeah, so you write in your book that to calm these elderly patients down, they would then diagnose them with late onset schizophrenia so they could be calmed down using this drug. And that kept the staffing levels low. But I was also shocked to read about in your book that, these young boys were putting on enormous amounts of weight. And they probably didn't even realize that they had breasts because they were so overweight, right?
Exactly.
To remove it, you couldn't just stop the drug and the breast went away. You needed surgery, right, to remove
Right, they're permanent. Once a boy grows breasts, they will have those breasts forever unless they have a double mastectomy. And these, of course, are the most vulnerable. If they're being prescribed Risperdal, they've got some real problems going on. So the idea of putting these most vulnerable children under the knife to get double mastectomies is just horrifying. And again, what is astonishing is that Johnson & Johnson knew exactly what was happening and did it anyway because it was profitable.
Okay, but switching gears. So when I think of the most evil pharma company, Purdue Pharma springs to mind, right?
Sure.
And the opioid crisis and the Sackler family. But there's an underlying story there as well that you tell in your.
Sure. Roughly, okay, so there's been 3 opioid crises in the United States. We're now in the Mexican fentanyl crisis, but the original one had to do with prescription opioids. And basically Purdue Pharma and Johnson & Johnson persuaded doctors to put aside their long-time unwillingness to risk addiction in their patients, taught these doctors, look, opioids aren't addictive, our products aren't addictive, they're highly effective, use them. And during that early period of the prescription opioid crisis, about 10% of the bodies that showed up in morgues had a Purdue Pharma product in their system. 60% had a J&J product in their system. J&J was arguably far more important to the opioid crisis than Purdue Pharma. Why don't you know that? Why doesn't anyone know that? And the reason is a great failing of my business, the reporters. Frankly, Purdue Pharma was an easy target. It's a tiny one-product drug company up in Bristol, Connecticut. Johnson & Johnson is the behemoth in the area. It's the largest healthcare products company in the world. It funds a lot of these journalistic organizations because it had one of the largest advertising budgets around, right? For Tylenol alone, the advertising budget in the 1980s was $100 million a year. So again and again and again, reporters tried to do some of these stories about Johnson & Johnson. The company would call the headquarters of the media organization that was about to run the story and say, if you run the story, we're going to pull all of our ads. And the story got killed. The reason, and now we've seen TV shows and all this sort of stuff focus exclusively on Purdue Pharma. It is a measure of just how extraordinary Johnson & Johnson's PR machinery and their ability to sidestep accountability is that almost no one knows that they, in fact, were probably the most important player in the opioid crisis.
You talk about these massive farms that they had in Tasmania and places where
in Australia.
They were supplying the other manufacturers.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah,
Wow.
They were the principal supplier.
Okay, and then let's move on to the birth patch, because there was a contraceptive pill that, when taken, could deliver the right dose, but then Johnson & Johnson developed this patch that ran into issues.
Sure. Well, as you guys know, you guys are device people.
Yes.
Technology has always been a kind of a holy grail of delivering drugs.
Yeah.
The problem with patches is that it's very difficult to kind of be sure that you're getting the perfect and right amount of drug, because it depends on how well you apply the patch. Sort of depends on if if water gets in there and all that sort of stuff. So Johnson & Johnson wanted to create this birth control patch because it thought it had actually developed originally its pack technology for fentanyl, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's part of their opioid sales was this fentanyl patch. And in fact, even with the fentanyl patch, people, particularly children, died because this patch would deliver often 150% more fentanyl than the patch suggested it would in the early hours. And for some, it was so much that it would lead them to die in their sleep. So Johnson & Johnson liked this technology, but knew going in to developing their birth control patch that there was real problems with control, and such problems that the company in the end decided to essentially double the amount of estrogen that was in the patch versus what the low dose birth control pills that have become the standard of care. And the problem with that, is most women who have had contraceptives know, is that estrogen causes all kinds of problems, right? It causes heart attacks and strokes. It causes breast tenderness. It causes severe discomfort. Of course, women go through these things even more when they're pregnant. But Johnson & Johnson basically lied to the FDA about the amount of estrogen that was in its patch, and lied to women for years and years and years. And so thousands of young women ended up, and I estimate in the book, Johnson & Johnson itself estimates that roughly 5,000 women in the United States suffered some sort of serious event like a heart attack, a stroke, or death because they took this patch that had twice as much estrogen as a low-dose birth control pill. And the FDA became so concerned about all the reports of all these deaths and strokes, they kept asking Johnson, what's going on? Why are there so many reports? And for basically 5 years, Johnson & Johnson said, I don't know, we don't know, until they finally admitted, well, we've actually been lying to you this entire time.
I need to take a breath.
This is just what I wanted to say. I think we need a little break on product, but we are also curious about reactions. And I have two questions for you. Here's the
Sure.
first one.
Yeah.
Your book makes a lot of claims of negative actions by J&J. What kind of reactions have you got from them? And aren't you afraid of them sending in their lawyers?
So I am afraid of them sending in their lawyers. And we had a lot of discussions with my publisher. We had their lawyers go through this. So Johnson & Johnson is basically a law firm with a drug and a device company attached. They have spent $38 billion on litigation expenses since 2011. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people around the world have sued them over, all of these products. And then we haven't even mentioned, metal on metal hip implants, vaginal mesh, some others, Propulsid.
We are coming to this.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a scary group of guys and women, of course. And the reason why you have never heard so many of these stories is because their intimidation through the use of lawyers and other means is real. I cannot tell you. I was on this beat, as you know, for more than a dozen years, and sort of even when I went to India and the White House, still sort of did some healthcare stories. So I know huge numbers of people in the pharma space at FDA and all the rest. And I cannot tell you the number of people who, as I was doing my reporting for this book, said, Gardner, you need to stop. You're crazy. They're going to come after you. And like on the antipsychotic disaster in particular, my book is really the first to try to put a number on the number of dead, and the number I finally got from this team at Sloan Kettering, and it was 1 million. And that is an incredibly conservative number. And when I originally called, there's an expert who everybody knows who it is. I will not mention this person's name. And I called this expert and I said, my back of the envelope calculation is at least 1 million people have died. What do you think? And this person said, oh, no, Gardner, I think you're way off. And I was like, do you think it's 500,000, 250,000? And he said, no, I think it's about 6 times the number you mentioned. And I was like, wait, you think 6 million people have died? And this person said, yeah, plus or minus 1 million. And I said, and you didn't think this would be worth writing about? And this person is a veteran, has in their 70s, what do they have to be afraid of? And this person said, do you know what kind of lawyers these people have? So the intimidation factor with this company is incredibly concerning and real. And it's why most of these stories have never been told. I did this anyway. And frankly, I thought it was kind of a suicide mission, but I thought it was so important that people like you, people in the field, understand what really happened, and that there is at least some accountability to the people who authored so many of these disasters. People like Alex Gorski, who was CEO of Johnson & Johnson for many of the years of the worst disasters.
Mm.
And what about you mentioned already J&J employees that were caught up in these activities. Have you heard from them?
I have, there are myriad reactions. Of course, I was on that beat for a long time. I actually grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, which is where a lot of Johnson & Johnson executives live. And, I grew up around the kids of these executives. And I grew up with this idea of Johnson & Johnson as the most ethical company around. So, yeah, I've had a lot of discussions. And as you might imagine, the reactions are mixed. There are some who are incredibly angry at me and who insist to this day that Johnson & Johnson is this incredibly ethical company. There are others who are somewhere in the middle. And then there's many who really cheered on the book and experienced their own moments of a kind of personal crisis when they realized that this company that they thought was so ethical was actually just the opposite. Let's not forget, Johnson & Johnson has pleaded guilty to criminal charges again and again and again. It pleaded guilty to bribing Saddam Hussein's regime. It has done, there is my endnote section on this book is, as tiny, tiny language print, and it's 80 pages long, right? I have thousands but it took me 5 years to do the research for this book. And the only way we could get it through the lawyers is that I documented absolutely every single one of my charges. And, that's why they haven't sued me at this point. So it is, and my arguments are inarguable. There is no response. And I know that you guys are going to ask me what has been the official response. And interviews and to other media organizations, they haven't really responded by any, with any specifics. They've just sort of said, we're looking toward the future, because there really isn't a response. They know what they did was appalling.
But there are many divisions and many products produced by J&J which do help people, right? And they have, I'm thinking of the laparoscopic division, ethical sutures are used in every procedure, and there's a lot of people there who go to J&J and do a great job and do an ethical job, right? There's thousands of people that work for this company who do their best every day, right? And live by, they have this credo of principles, right? Which is an interesting topic.
I think they call it the credo. I think it's a deeply problematic. I think mission statements, credos, all that credos are problematic because they, what Johnson & Johnson was best at, what it did better than any other company in the world, and it was sort of its core competency, is gaslighting its own employees, getting them to believe that conduct that was clearly on its face unethical was somehow okay. Sure, Johnson & Johnson has a lot of products that are absolutely beneficial, but let's think about that for a second, right? All prisons are filled with pretty good people who had a bad day and shot someone and killed them. Like, one action out of the millions in our lives can ruin your life. If you are a bank teller and you are honest for 40 years and then on your last day steal a couple of $100, you're a thief, and you will always be branded a thief. Doing helpful products is what Johnson & Johnson was supposed to do. What's extraordinary about Johnson & Johnson is the number of times it knowingly sold products that were dangerous and kept that information a secret. What's interesting, as you said, Kashif, is that to this day, opioids is seen as the worst, corporate misconduct ever. In fact, let's think about that for a second. Opioids are extremely effective therapy for pain. If you're in desperate pain, post-surgical pain, or if you are going to die, opioids is their right treatment for you. They are extremely effective. And so the opioid crisis is it's really kind of hard to pinpoint which of these patients shouldn't have gotten opioids. Clearly, what happened is that opioids began to be prescribed to people with moderate pain, with back pain, all that sort of stuff, where the risks of the drug do not outweigh their benefits. But in case after case after case of these other products that I mentioned, like EPO in cancer, has no benefit to the patient. None. It has nothing but risk. If you look at Risperdal in the elderly population, there is no benefit to giving Risperdal to a patient with dementia. And FDA says that in the label. It is not approved for dementia, which means there is no benefit, zero benefit, and death is the risk. And that's what happened in case after case after case, which is, unlike opioids, many of these other products, another story I tell is Propulsid. It was a heartburn drug. They tested it in babies, 20 separate times. Now, I think you guys know a little bit about the ethics of clinical trials. You know that children are a protected class. You are not supposed to undertake a clinical trial unless you have very, very good reason to believe that a product is going to be beneficial for children. Johnson & Johnson conducted 20 separate pediatric clinical trials of Propulsid. It shouldn't have ethically been able to conduct the fourth clinical trial, because once you failed 3 times, you can no longer say that you have a really good idea that this will be beneficial. Nonetheless, it did. All 20 failed. The company nonetheless sold Propulsid secretly for pediatric patients so successfully that 1 in 5 preemie babies in the United States were prescribed Propulsid for spit up, even though it knew 2 things. 1, it didn't help these babies, and 2, it caused QT prolongation, which is a heart arrhythmia problem that is particularly dangerous in infants. So this pile of dead babies gets bigger and bigger and bigger. the FDA gets more and more concerned and asks Johnson & Johnson why this is still happening. And Johnson & Johnson simply lies to the FDA, says, we have no idea, even though the company knows that it's underwriting an illegal pediatric marketing program to sell the drug. And this was huge for me because I actually got the documents in this case just shortly after my own son had been in the NICU unit after his birth. So here was one of these situations where there but the grace of God go I, that my own child could have been a victim for this campaign. And in the fact that a company that describes itself as the baby company would knowingly sell a drug that killed babies and had no benefit for them is one of those where you just kind of can't believe it.
It's mind-blowing. So
You mentioned FDA several times now. Let's talk about the FDA for a moment. When I was a sales rep and my product was FDA approved, honestly, I felt safe. To add to this point, when I sold a product which was CE marked only, the first question I got was, but is it FDA approved?
Right.
So it seems to be trusted certificate for us when we have FDA approved products. Can you tell us about the early history of the FDA and now the modern FDA?
Sure. Well, as you know, the FDA was it was essentially a part of the agriculture department. It was just sort of a testing bureau. It was established in the first few years, 1903 of the 20th century. It then got larger powers in the 1930s because of this scandal involving an anti-infective drug that they actually had antifreeze included in it. And this medicine ended up killing at least 75 people in the United States, confirmed probably many more deaths, including children. And FDA then got the power to test whether drugs had unknown ingredients and dangers. And then, as Kashif was talking about, in the 1960s, the thalidomide scandal, when a German company sold this thalidomide for use amongst pregnant women as an anti-nausea drug and didn't really test whether it caused teratogenic effects, which, as you know, are dangerous effects on the fetus. And then, thousands of babies emerge with just flippers for arms. And that scandal led to what's known as the Kefauver Amendments in the United States in 1962 and 63, in which FDA finally got the power to essentially approve drugs and require that drugs prove that they were both safe and effective before sale. So that was the history of the FDA. Unfortunately, the FDA started to get overwhelmed in the 70s and the 80s, and their approval time frame for drugs started to slip into more than a year. And when the AIDS crisis hit, AIDS advocates protested the FDA's headquarters, threw red paint on the headquarters to refer to blood, and said that FDA's delays had put blood on their hands and that people's lives were being lost. So the commissioner at the time, David Kessler, decided he needed more money, and Congress was not about to give him more money to speed up review time. So he went to the industry and said, look, if you give us fees, we'll speed up review times. And that, in 1992, the first deal was struck, and that essentially ended the FDA as an independent assessor of the industry, because now most of FDA's budget is underwritten by fees. Each of these 5-year agreements with the industry has led the FDA to concede more and more powers to industry. And so the book really talks about FDA's role in all of these disasters. And it's a really damning portrait. And, Silke, what happens? I mean, one of the ways that Johnson & Johnson gaslights its employees is, just as you say, they tell their drug sales reps, look, this product is approved by the FDA, and the FDA examines all of our sales materials. So you can be assured that what we're saying is legal. Well, in fact, the FDA does not examine sales materials. Many of these sales diagrams and handouts were blatantly illegal. And, there's only like one person in the marketing materials office at the FDA. Drug makers send these things in there, but they're often never examined by the FDA. So FDA's reputation of probity, of being tough, actually helps companies like Johnson and Johnson do just the opposite. Because in fact, that mythology of the FDA as a very tough cop is a myth. The FDA is very easy on Johnson and Johnson and allowed all of these disasters to happen.
Now, we talk about the FDA. I think is one very interesting aspect here. You talk about the fact that they were overwhelmed with the number of applications, the amount of work that needs to be done. And one of the concepts that I remember when I started in this industry was this grandfathering, right? If there was something that had already been approved, that you could launch something similar or on the back of that, right? And this leads into the metal on metal story when it comes to hip replacements, right? So in a hip replacement, you have the stem that goes into the leg, and into the hip you have a ball. So you have a ball,
The ball,
right?
yeah.
And typically that's a polyethylene, that's a plastic on metal. Johnson Johnson developed this cobalt alloy metal on metal hip, which was supposed to be a lot more better wearing and a lot of smoother, but perhaps also designed for younger patients. Not just Johnson Johnson. There were these products had been out in the market before.
In the late 1960s and early 70s, the McKee Ferrar implants, right, from the UK.
Yeah.
So you're exactly right. The oversight, the regulation of devices between the United States and Europe is very different, as you guys know. There really isn't an approval process for devices in Europe. You can just sort of start, as you said, CE certified. You can just start, you can get a certification, a private certification in Europe and start selling. Now, it's a little bit different because in Europe, you have largely governments are the buyers of medical products. And so they often ask for proof before they will widely purchase these devices. But they can be used. In the United States, the FDA does its own approval process.
It's been massively tightened up now, moving from MDD to MDR recently in recent years.
It has. But as you know, this has been an evolving process. The FDA has had a device approval process since 1977, which was when that process was undertaken. Originally, the idea was that all complex devices would have to essentially go through the same testing as drugs, and particularly devices that went into the body. They grandfathered in a whole series of devices under something called the 5K kind of loophole. And basically the idea was until FDA came up with a solid list of all the devices that needed to be tested, completely, we're going to let onto the market any device that kind of just has a little brief update for devices that had already previously been approved. So they've grandfathered in. So what you basically in those early years say is that you needed a predicate device. So a device that had been approved before, if you tell us that your device is just like that device, we'll just let you go through. Well, the point of the 510K process was that it was only supposed to last a couple of years. It is still in place, essentially 50 years later. And that's because the device industry wants it to be in place. And so what's happened is that device makers essentially tell the FDA that their device is just like a device that has been around since 1977, the era of Selectric typewriters and rotary phones. And then the FDA says, okay, it's just like a rotary phone. And then device makers go out to doctors and say, this is like a Maserati. This is like AI. This is, completely different from things from the 1970s. So it's, the process itself has this sort of lie at its core. And what Johnson & Johnson did was they actually said that their predicate device for selling this metal on metal hip implant, which they said would last longer than ones with plastic in the middle, were these McKee Ferrar devices that had failed spectacularly. Yes. So the law does not distinguish between grandfathered devices that failed, yes, and grandfathered devices that succeeded. So you can actually point to a device that caused a disaster prior to 1977 and say, our device is just like this device that caused this complete disaster, and you have to approve it because it was approved before 1977. And that's how Johnson and Johnson got these metal on metal, these Pinnacle metal on metal and XL metal on metal hip implants onto the market. And predictably, they caused an enormous disaster.
What I read, which really horrified me, because I used to be in the orthopedic industry, was that prior to submitting to the FDA for approval, an engineer discovered that these were failing in the simulator. So Johnson & Johnson then had an issue, right? They had to think about maybe doing a redesign, pausing, maybe launching this product at a later date after more testing. What did they do?
So you're exactly right. So Johnson & Johnson's explanation to the FDA of why their devices were going to be better than this earlier generation that had failed so spectacularly was they said basically the early devices had a large gap between the cup and the ball, and that modern machining methods will allow them to make that gap infinitesimally small, and that because the gap is so small, that fluid from the body will always be in this gap, and that the cup and the ball, even though they're cobalt metal, will never touch. So the earlier devices failed because these rubbed together and they threw off a huge amount of poisonous metal ions that made people blind, that hurt their brains, that killed all the surrounding tissues. And Johnson & Johnson said, look, our devices are going to be so tight together that problem will never happen. Well, on the Friday before they were set to ask for FDA approval, as you said, these devices all failed in the simulator. So the engineers all said, okay, well, the problem is that the cup and the ball are too close together. We're going to widen the gap between the cup and the ball, which basically made them exactly like the earlier generation of devices. We're going to widen the gap, and that's how we're going to get through the simulator testing. So that they figured this out on a Friday. On the following Monday, the next business day, they submit their application to the FDA, which, by the way, includes sworn affidavits. Executives from Johnson & Johnson have to sign sworn statements saying that the descriptions of the device that they are providing are the devices that they will be selling. Well, they had this old description of a very tight gap. And in fact, they knew that they had just increased the gap. And these executives signed these sworn statements that they were going to be selling a device with a very tight gap, even though they knew that was false. They swore a lie, and FDA didn't catch it for years. And by then, this disaster had taken off around the world.
I was a sales rep in orthopedics, and I remember attending some revision cases where metal on metal hips, I can't remember which brand it was, but once you open up, I mean, it's a mass of black.
Exactly.
It's horrible, right? It's this black residue that comes out. It's disgusting. But ironically, and you write about this in your book, the cup is fixed inside the pelvis, right? The hip is fixed inside the hip. You don't want to take them out. It will cause a lot more damage. If the bone is held, you just replace the inner metal lining with a plastic lining, right?
Right. So
Which
they
is manufactured by J&J.
Right. So J&J actually made even more money because they created this total disaster. So doctors had to go in with revisions, as you say, resurgeries, and affix essentially a plastic liner on the stem so that it's the two metal sides no longer touched. And so there, as you know, in the book, there are all these emails from these Johnson & Johnson executives celebrating that there are so many revisions happening because their revisions business is taking off. And, as this trial lawyer said in one of these trials, look, if I sell you an iPhone and immediately it falls apart, you expect to go back and get a new iPhone for free. Johnson Johnson was like selling defective product, and then you had to go back and buy a different product. Like there's no returns, there's no refunds. They're doubling their money.
When I was in the industry, we would do these longevity studies. There would be these studies going on all the time, right? Where we're looking at the, survival rates, right? Johnson, they had studies.
Oh yeah, and they lied through their teeth about the results that they were getting. And again, this is like one of these amazing things that comes out in testimony. The company claimed that they didn't actually know that all of these devices were failing in these patients. The problem is that the people that who were supposed to be the authors of these studies, and we all know that ghostwriting was going on, were the ones who had all these failures. So somehow Johnson and Johnson, it got caught in these trials because on the one hand, they didn't want to say that they ghost wrote all these studies. On the other hand, it's the very surgeons who were the authors of the studies are the ones who were not reporting to the company anyway all of these revisions. So the Johnson and Johnson executive would say, well, we didn't know about the revisions, but it was our own authors who were keeping the revisions from us somehow.
Yeah.
And then, of course, as you know, in one case, one of these authors had been told by his own IRB, this is in Jacksonville, Florida,
Yes.
you cannot participate in this study. You do not have IRB approval. This is unethical. And this guy promises to his IRB that he will no longer participate and that copies Johnson and Johnson on this promise and then continues to send in data, continues to send, one of the amazing things about the metal on metal hip implant story is, as you know, there are nearly sacred rules around the conduct of clinical trials. You have to have patient consent. You have to have IRB approval. You have to collect data honestly. You cannot lie about all this stuff. And Johnson & Johnson broke every single one of those patient rules. It didn't get IRB approval for most of its patients. Many of the patient consents were clearly forged. One of these surgeons had a huge number of these consents signed on Christmas Day and never explained how it was that all these patients were coming into his office on Christmas Day. Another guy had sworn to his IRB that he was not doing the trial when he was. And so Johnson & Johnson never punished any of these people, including its own employees, who knew these ethical rules. Again, basically sacred rules that had come from the Nuremberg trials out of World War II were all being violated.
You talk about these 9 surgeons, this is an astronomical number, who were basically paid $184 million, right? For 9 surgeons. I mean, not equally amount. And then there's one doctor, the doctor in Middlesbrough, because UK is close to my heart, Dr. Nagel, who they went and told him that it wasn't the implant, right? It was his technique. Is that correct?
Sure.
Yeah.
That's what they did again and again. As surgeons started seeing all of these problems, all of these revisions, and in the literature, in the spine journal, people started reporting what were known as pseudo tumors, which were these sacs of black liquid that you know of. And Johnson & Johnson, even though Johnson & Johnson's own measuring stick for these devices started to show that a huge number of revisions, 10-fold more than what was the standard and 20-fold more than what they were telling the industry was their failure rate. They knew it internally that this was going on, but they told doctors like Dr. Nagel, actually, we're not seeing this at all. It must be you and your surgical technique being bad. And this was a deliberate effort. I have the internal documents. They say the way to keep this secret is to tell doctors it's their fault, not ours.
Yeah. So, and then, no, you're right that in March 2008, sales were over $1 billion, right? But then in 2009, the Australian Health Authority, the cavalry came in, right?
Yep. Well, that's the great thing. I mean, again, as you guys know, devices, the regulatory infrastructure between the United States and other countries is very different. One of the great things that that the UK does, and actually Australia does better than anyone else in the world, is have these device registries. So even though you have less, your bar for initial sales and approval is somewhat lower, you have a much better post-approval surveillance system in much of Europe, particularly in Australia and also in the UK, to see how devices are actually operating in the real world. And you guys track this in a way that the United States still doesn't come close to doing. In the United States, it's still largely a passive surveillance system. The FDA takes, says to surgeons, if you want to send in a report about something bad going on, please do. But the FDA doesn't go out and actively undertake polls of, let's call patients, let's see how these things are doing. And you guys actually in the UK and even more in Australia actually have active surveillance systems. So you tend to catch problems much earlier than they do in the United States. And that's why the Australians, were really the first to figure out on a truly scientific basis that these were failing in huge numbers. And the same thing happened, by the way, with vaginal mesh. It was really
I just wanted to come to this.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go to that.
Johnson & Johnson knew. I mean, what's amazing about it is, okay, Johnson & Johnson lied to the FDA about what it knew about metal-on-metal hip implants. The company knew before it started selling vaginal mesh that a third of women who were implanted with these meshes would never be able to have vaginal sex again because it would be so painful. They nonetheless started selling this broadly around the world, and they didn't even ask for FDA's approval. They just sold. So with vaginal mesh, they didn't even bother lying to the FDA. They just sold without the FDA's approval. And, the appalling story about FDA, and I tell this, is that Johnson & Johnson actually ended up saving the FDA's budget in the 2012 budgeting year. The FDA commissioner at the time, the industry was not agreeing to sign up for these fees. The FDA commissioner calls Alex Gorski, the soon-to-be CEO of Johnson & Johnson, asks for his help. He agrees to help. He gets the industry to go along. He uses Johnson & Johnson's lobbyists to sell it. He saves the FDA. And the FDA, perhaps not coincidentally, in the next few years, doesn't require the company to withdraw vaginal mesh, doesn't require the company to withdraw metal-on-metal hip implants. Despite guilty pleas for its criminal conduct in Risperdal, no executive at Johnson & Johnson is criminally prosecuted. Within a year, the FDA issues a statement about baby powder saying that it's safe, even though FDA has really no idea about this. So again and again and again, after Johnson & Johnson saves the FDA saves Johnson & Johnson.
Gardiner, I was especially curious about this vaginal mesh story because I sold vaginal laser, and there are also other alternatives for this indication, but all of these alternatives are classified as aesthetic treatments, while I think the mesh is reimbursed in Europe. FDA approval is one thing, but reimbursement is the other thing. Why do you think this was possible to have this as the only reimbursed treatment option?
Well, because, prolapse is a serious problem, particularly in older women. Nearly half of all women suffer some symptoms of prolapse, which is when the extraordinary flexibility that women have in that they can have essentially a 10-pound parasite in their bodies just before birth pushes aside all of their organs. The miracle of a woman's body is just astonishing, but that flexibility works against women when they get older, because what happens is their organs tend to sag. As we all experience sag in our face, we also experience sag inside of us, and your organs start to sag, and many women feel pressure. In some cases, their vaginal core starts going out. So they experience, obviously, urine problems. So these are serious medical conditions.
But what to my point is all the other alternative companies claim the same, but they don't get any reimbursement for their treatment. This is classified aesthetics. Only for the mesh, it was possible to get reimbursement. So there must be something different.
Well, I think one of the reasons why subsequent products do not get reimbursed was the experience of vaginal mesh. I mean, I
Okay.
think the OBGYN community has basically, I mean, unfortunately, ACOG, which is the OBGYN Professional Society in the United States, originally put out a statement warning physicians against using vaginal mesh. Johnson & Johnson got its consultants in ACOG to rally and withdraw that warning. And so ACOG has some culpability in the disaster that resulted, that ruined the lives of hundreds of thousands of women. And I think subsequently, the field has become very skeptical of any of these surgical devices in pop repair because many of the non-surgical interventions really have proven to be every bit as efficacious with none of these side effects.
I think when I hear about J&J and women, I think about the baby powder, the patches, the mesh, and hip replacements. Mostly elderly women get hip replacements as well.
Sure, and I didn't even talk about
Yeah.
the blender for hysterectomies, which is
Yes,
called
of course.
Femara, that
Yeah.
was supposed to be this laparoscopic way of having a hysterectomy. Johnson & Johnson knew that what it basically did is you inserted this blender and it chewed up the uterus inside and then tried to suck out the cells. But in roughly 1 out of every 300 women, they have occult endometrial cancer in their uterus that has not been identified. And so by sending in this blender, you're splattering the abdominal core of women with cancerous cells, and a huge number of women ended up dying. And again, I didn't even do a chapter on that. In fact, the book was originally twice as long as the book you have, and we had to cut out just a lot of stuff, and that device was among the many that ended up getting cut out. Yeah,
Yeah, I remember that
of
story.
devices and drugs that this company has sold, knowing that they were dangerous, is really astonishing.
Okay, so we're about encouraging people to progress their career within our industry, to join our industry. So I don't want to paint our entire industry. What can we learn? I said at the beginning, this was a cautionary tale. What are the things that we can learn from what we've read about in your book? What
Well,
would you
I
recommend?
want to say this is not an anti-pharma book. This is an
Yeah.
anti-J&J book. And for instance, in the Risperdal case, I have the grand jury files for Risperdal. I have the grand jury files for Eli Lilly's Zyprexa, which was a similar antipsychotic. They had a similar illegal marketing scheme. Eli Lilly pleaded guilty to criminal charges. Johnson & Johnson pleaded guilty to criminal charges. But Eli Lilly, when it understood this case was coming to it, called in the guy who was in charge of the Zyprexa marketing and fired him on the spot. They actually escorted him. They had guards take him to his desk, let him collect a few things, and they escorted him out of the building, and he was never allowed inside again. Johnson & Johnson took the guy who was in charge of their illegal Risperdal marketing program, to which they pleaded guilty and paid a $2.2 billion fine, and they made him their CEO. It is two different, wholly different responses to problematic conduct. There are good companies in this industry. I covered all of them. I think a lot of the European companies I think Europeans tend to be a little more ethical than the Americans for a variety of reasons. The American healthcare system tends to lead to more bad behavior. Doctors in the United States, serve as consultants. There is frank bribery that goes on. Every single device company has essentially agreed to charges that they bribed orthopedic surgeons for years and years and years. And that sort of behavior just is not standard in Europe. I also think that it's important. Look, I think another reason why Europeans tend to be less amenable parallel to unethical conduct is if you get fired and lose your job, your kids don't lose healthcare. It's government provided healthcare. The hole that you drop into when you lose your job in Europe is not nearly as deep and dire as the hole that you drop into in the United States.
Right.
So it allows, I think, Europeans to sort of call a halt to behavior they think is unethical far more readily, really, than their American counterparts. And people should, use their brains. I mean, to me, one of the things, I interviewed hundreds of Johnson & Johnson sales reps and others, and many of them were just sort of appalled that they believed the company's reassurances for so long. And some of them, it nearly destroyed them when they looked back and realized that they had been part of criminal conduct that had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. So, get into the industry. It's amazing. Innovation is a wonderful thing, helping people to live better lives. Do not let yourself get caught up in something that makes you fundamentally uncomfortable.
I think that's great. I think barring doctors from taking money and gifts you mentioned, right? That's an important one. Also, our companies, we never used to in Europe have to report quarterly. It used to be half year annually. We are now reporting more and more quarterly to come in line with US companies, but that puts a lot of pressure every 3 months on the commercial side of the business, right? Because you don't want your share price to drop. An interesting one you mentioned is that medical education should not be paid for by pharma and medical device companies. It's interesting because the amount of education that's paid for by the companies is humongous, right?
Yeah. Well, listen, as you guys know, what happened in the United States really in the 1970s and the 1980s is that drug companies basically got the prescription records for every physician in the country. So you could, beginning in the late 1970s and early 90s, because of the proliferation of computing power, sales reps got to see exactly what doctors were prescribing. And then they could measure very closely what sales tactics led to changes in prescribing habits. And the industry in the 1980s basically learned that if they gave money to doctors, they would get a fourfold return. Every dollar that they gave to a doctor brought a fourfold return in sales, somewhere between 4 and 5-fold. And so the sales organizations in the United States, which had been made up mostly of pharmacists, really drug experts, ended up changing in the 80s and 90s to cheerleaders, very attractive people, because these drug companies realized that doctors didn't want education. They wanted cheerleaders and they wanted money. And it was that change that led to the growth in just a huge amount of corruption. It led to the opioid crisis, the atypical antipsychotic crisis, the EPO. It's all because basically drug companies were paying doctors to endanger their patients. And that never really happened in the same way in Europe. And you're right. I think every study that has ever been done about drug companies giving doctors money, food, and gifts has shown it makes doctors worse at their jobs, not better. It needs to stop.
Is there a role for the competitors? We talk about the FDA, the doctors. What about Johnson & Johnson's competitors? Is there a role there that they can play?
Sure. So every single one of these, all of the FDA actions that FDA took against Johnson & Johnson for its illegal marketing, and there weren't that many, but all of them resulted from complaints from competitors. So if you look through the FDA files on, for instance, the Risperdal illegal marketing scheme, Eli Lilly was writing very detailed letters to the FDA. Look, this is what Johnson & Johnson is doing. It's illegal. You need to stop it. Unfortunately, of course, FDA really got out of the business of policing illegal conduct in the industry. Once 1992, FDA started being funded by the industry. So yes, competitors can help marginally, but you actually need someone who receives these complaints and does something about them. And that's just not where the FDA is anymore.
You mentioned in your book that something that Silke and I were debating on the weekend, you need to explain to us, is enabling personal injury suits against the FDA. Can you not?
Right.
Can
So
you
what
not go
what
after
happened?
the FDA? Yeah.
Okay, so the American criminal justice system is wildly complicated, but you can sue drug makers both in federal court and in state court. And there are different rules that govern suits in both. But in nearly half of American states, they have a law that says if a product has been approved by the FDA, you can't sue and say that it's dangerous because it was, the FDA is seen as this expert and learned intermediary that is just doing the right thing and is protecting patients. So it disallows lawsuits because of this image of the FDA as this protector of American patients. That's not what the FDA is. The FDA is mostly a protector of American industry. And so I say that those laws have this fundamentally false premise that the FDA is there to protect you. It's not. It's there to protect the industry. And so I don't think those laws make any sense. I think states should allow lawsuits because really now lawsuits have become the only way to police this industry because the government isn't doing it.
So can you?
Gardiner, after all these difficult topics, I have two simple questions for you. First, what is the route for becoming a medical journalist? And as our podcast is about careers, is it possible for someone in our industry to become a medical journalist?
Absolutely. And in fact, I think some of these stories should be told by you guys because you guys know it better than almost anyone. And unfortunately, it takes a lot of courage to decide to tell these stories. I mean, you could look as a model. I don't know if you've read the Facebook book called Careless People, and it was written by a woman who actually worked for Facebook. And she lives in London, and Facebook has sued her, and you can sort of see the dangers. But that book had a profound impact on the United States because someone deep inside Facebook wrote about what was really happening. And many of these stories that I tell could have been told even better by someone who was a sales rep, who lived through it. So I actually think.
But then they can never go back to the industry anymore.
No,
They need to make the decision from now on, I'm a journalist.
Well, so do it in your 50s. I mean, I think there's a lot of people out there who have these stories and I've spoken to them. And I'm not saying it's an easy path. And I'll tell you, this book took me way too many years. I probably, ended up making about, 50 cents an hour for all the work that I made on this book. And it's a passion project, and you have to have this kind of passion. But unfortunately, journalism right now is declining. The number of journalists in the United States have really cut in half over the last 15 years. And with the rise of AI, it'll probably get cut in half again in the next 15 years. I end up talking to young journalists and prospective journalists all the time. And I'm sort of like, if there's something else you can do, you should probably think about something else because it's such a difficult era in journalism. But if there's hope, I mean, I think it's wonderful when people with your kind of expertise and background write about these things. And this podcast is an example of that, right? I mean, this is journalism. You guys are doing a wonderful thing in talking about issues in your industry and even having a crazy person like me on your podcast who almost certainly is telling things that many of your listeners don't really want to hear. I mean, it's a really wonderful thing. And I wish that there was more of it.
And after spending 5 years on this book, can you share what your next project is? Or is it still confidential?
It's confidential. Just as you know, I'm always worried about getting sued. I'm working on something, but I'm going to keep it a secret for as long as I can.
But also in medical field, or are you working in other fields as well?
I'm staying in healthcare. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Might have to get you back on.
In 5 years from now.
Okay.
There you
So, yeah, we close this session with our traditional question, Gardiner. What are the three things you know now that you wish you had known then? And then it's up to your definition.
Huh. Um, I think there's several. Just in terms of the process of the book, I had no idea that it was going to take me this many years to do, and I'm not sure I would have done it if I'd known just how hard it is. I wish I had hired an outside editor, which I relied on the editor and at my publisher, and publishers don't really edit books nowadays. And so I wish that I had hired someone to kind of help me in the process in the early going. What is there about? I think one of my big ones that I mean, as you know in the book, I admit to a lot of failures on my own part. A lot of these stories didn't get told beforehand. And I was one of the most important reporters on the beat at the time. And I tried to do some of them I couldn't get through the New York Times. I think to me, I was more forgiving and of FDA's failures when I was the FDA reporter than I should have been. I mean, when you look at the history, for instance, of opioids, it took FDA something like 15 years to increase the warnings on all of these opioid products. And that is a spectacular failure on the part of American government. The FDA's refusal to police this industry, there were nearly 300 whistleblower cases against the drug industry during this period of time. They paid something like 30 some odd billion dollars in fines. And all of this happened under the FDA's watch. The only policing that happened was as a result of these whistleblower cases. And I should have been tougher on the FDA. I was pretty tough on the FDA. They routinely complained. But I think I should have done a better job pointing out that the opioid crisis was really a crisis of American governance.
Gardner, thank you so much. I mean, this podcast has flown by, and it's been a lot of wow moments. But I think what we want to say is thank you, not just for being on the podcast, but for writing this book, right? It's been so brave, right? It's a powerful company you've gone up against, but it is, like I said, it's a cautionary tale for our business. And the vast majority of the thousands and thousands of people who work in our industry and the pharma industry are doing it because they want to help people. They want to make people's lives better. They want people to live longer. And this motivates some of them to become the whistleblowers that you are.
Yeah. I mean, again, my message is listen to your gut. One of the great things, as you know, in the EPO story, Roche, the only reason we know that EPO causes cancer is that Roche actually decided to test an EPO product. And the executives in Roche, when they saw that the EPO patients were dying at a much more rapid patient's rate than those who didn't get EPO, that the Roche executives finally said, we can't do this. We have to publish these. And that's how the information came out, is that instead of Johnson & Johnson keeping everything a secret for all of these years, suddenly a different company was involved. And in this case, a European company. And it was the Europeans, this oncologist in Freiburg, Germany, and some of the Roche executives who said, we're not doing this anymore. So listen to gut.
100%. It's our duty as being in this industry to be vigilant, to make sure that the compliance rules are absolutely obeyed and people pay attention to them, and to be able to call things out. Don't be afraid to call things out. It's so important because at the end of the day, there's patience at the end of what we do.
Yeah.
Once again, thank you for your time today. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you, guys.
No more tears. No more tears. It's still in hardback, I think, but the paperback will probably come out very soon. It's the best read I've had since.
I have it as an ebook. I cannot show it now.
It's the best read since Bad Blood, and it's been a while since that came out. And I encourage everyone to get out and read it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into our MedTech Lives. You have been listening to Zilka Rima and Tash Ikran. We're committed to bringing you insights and stories that inspire and inform the medical community. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network.